My name is Colleen. I am a 32-year-old senior underwriter for a boutique insurance firm in Hartford, Connecticut, and until 48 hours ago, I believed that blood was thicker than water. But as I lie here in room 412 of St. Francis Hospital and Medical Center, watching my younger sister smirk at my shattered collarbone, I realize blood is nothing more than a biological coincidence. The air in this room is heavy with the clinical, suffocating scent of isopropyl alcohol and the faint, citrusy trail of Natalie's $200 Jo Malone basil and neroli perfume, a fragrance that feels like an insult in a place where people are fighting for their breath. I am hooked up to a Baxter Sigma Spectrum infusion pump that rhythmically clicks as it delivers a steady stream of saline and morphine into my system, a sound that should be soothing but only serves to underscore the silence between us. Natalie stands at the foot of my adjustable Hillrom Medfurgy bed, looking like she just stepped off a photo shoot for a high-end lifestyle magazine rather than visiting a sibling who was nearly killed by a distracted driver in a 2024 silver Lexus RX 350. She is wearing a cream-colored Max Mara wool coat that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment on my modest condo in West Hartford, and she has just reached up with manicured fingers to adjust her $450 Prada Symboli sunglasses, which she hasn't bothered to take off despite being indoors. Her voice is a polished melodic weapon as she looks at my pale face and the bruising that has turned the left side of my neck a sickly shade of deep purple and mottled yellow. "You look absolutely terrible, Colleen," she says with a dismissive flick of her wrist toward the foredrip that is currently keeping my pain levels at a manageable 6 out of 10. She doesn't ask how the surgery on my fractured clavicle went or if the doctors are worried about the internal hematoma near my ribs. Instead, she leans against the metal footboard with a practiced grace that makes my stomach churn. "Maybe it is finally time to let someone actually capable handle Aunt Evelyn's estate because you clearly cannot even handle a green light at an intersection," she adds, her smirk widening into something sharp and predatory. The mention of our late aunt's estate makes the monitor beside me beep faster as my heart rate climbs toward 95 beats per minute. Aunt Evelyn left me as the sole executor of her $3.8 million portfolio, including the historic Victorian property on Prospect Avenue and a diversified Vanguard brokerage account, because she knew Natalie would liquidate it all for a summer in St. Tropez within 6 months. I can feel the jagged edges of my bone grinding slightly as I try to shift my weight, a searing white-hot flash of agony that I refuse to let show on my face. My fingers, cold and slightly swollen, grip the cold stainless steel of the bed rail so hard that my knuckles turn white. "The only thing you are going to be handling, Natalie, is your own immediate exit from this room," I say, and my voice sounds like ice scraping against a windshield in the dead of a New England January. She starts to open her mouth, likely to mention the legal petition her shark of a lawyer has been threatening to file to contest the will, but I cut her off before she can breathe another word of her manufactured sympathy. "Get out of this room right now before I have the nursing station call security to escort you to the parking garage," I command, staring directly into the dark tint of her Prada lenses. I watch her jaw tighten, the only sign that my words actually landed, before she turns on her 4-inch Christian Louboutin heels, the red soles flashing like a warning sign as she clicks across the sterile linoleum floor toward the heavy oak door without looking back. As the door swings shut with a soft, pressurized thud, I am left alone with the hum of the air filtration system and the crushing realization that the accident on Main Street was only the beginning of the wreckage I am going to have to navigate. I stare at the ceiling tiles, counting the tiny perforations to keep from crying, knowing that the battle for Evelyn's legacy has officially shifted from polite legal letters to open warfare while I am still pinned to a hospital mattress. My name is Colleen, and exactly 24 hours before the screeching tires and the bone-shattering impact redefined my reality, I was standing in the dimly lit high-security corridors of the Pentagon, finishing a grueling 14-hour shift as a logistics commander. At 32, my entire existence is built on the foundation of military precision, a life dictated by 5 o'clock sharp 4-mile runs through the humid Virginia morning and back-to-back tactical briefings where a single misplaced decimal point could delay a shipment of critical supplies to a base halfway across the globe. I managed my personal bank account with the same disciplined rigors as a federal budget, tracking every cent of my $86,000 annual salary down to the last copper penny in a complex Excel spreadsheet that I updated every Friday night. While my peers were upgrading to flashy European imports, I took pride in my magnetic gray 2018 Ford Escape with 82,000 miles on the odometer, a vehicle that was paid off in full and maintained with obsessive regularity, Its oil changed every 5,000 miles at the same local garage. I am the woman who prepares for every contingency, the one who keeps a tactical first aid kit and 3 days of emergency rations in her trunk, yet I never accounted for the chaos of my own sister. Natalie, born just 26 months after me, exists in a parallel universe where consequences are merely suggestions and debt is an abstract concept. She currently resides in a 2-bedroom luxury condo in the Pearl District that she absolutely cannot afford on her non-existent income, masquerading as a high-end luxury consultant to socialites who have no idea she is currently dodging 14 different credit card collectors and 3 final notice letters from her utility providers. I remember the last time I saw her bank statement by accident, a horrifying tapestry of overdrawn fees and $300 dinners at places like Le Diplomate, all funded by the desperate hope that Aunt Evelyn would eventually bail her out. We may share the same DNA and the same childhood memories of summers spent in the Connecticut woods, but we are separated by a chasm of character that no amount of family loyalty can bridge. While I was coordinating the movement of millions of dollars in government equipment with a steady hand and a clear conscience, Natalie was likely lying to a Neiman Marcus personal shopper about her credit limit. It is a bitter irony that my life of careful planning and tactical foresight was upended in a single second by a driver who lacked a fraction of my focus, leaving me broken in a hospital bed while my sister circles like a vulture over the estate I spent my life protecting. I think back to that 5 o'clock run just yesterday, the rhythmic sound of my Brooks Ghost 15 sneakers hitting the pavement and the cool morning air filling my lungs, a moment of perfect control before the world tilted on its axis. Now, as I stare at the sterile white walls of this room, the contrast between my disciplined service and Natalie's reckless vanity feels like a physical weight on my chest, heavier even than the medical-grade sling holding my shoulder together. I had everything calculated, every variable accounted for in my logistics reports in my personal life, but I failed to realize that the most dangerous threat to my stability wasn't a foreign adversary or a market crash, but the sibling who shares my last name and none of my values. The scent of the Pentagon's recycled air and burnt coffee seems like a lifetime ago, replaced now by the hum of the morphine pump and the realization that my meticulously ordered world has been infiltrated by a woman who views a $3.8 million inheritance as nothing more than a way to fund another year of her hollow, glittering masquerade. Family is supposed to be the unit you can deploy with when everything else fails, but as I lie here, I understand that in the war of Evelyn's estate, my sister isn't an ally. She is the primary target of my defense. The encrypted line on my government-issued iPhone 15 Pro crackled with a sterile digital precision when the call from my estate attorney, Mark Dalton of Dalton & Associates, finally came through at exactly 16:42 on a Tuesday afternoon that had felt otherwise unremarkable. I remember the exact timestamp because I was just finishing a logistical manifest for a shipment of heavy-duty generators bound for a base in Eastern Europe, and the vibration of the phone against the mahogany surface of my desk felt like a localized earthquake. Mark's voice was somber, carrying the heavy weight of professional grief as he confirmed the news I had been dreading for weeks, that our great-aunt Evelyn had finally passed away in her sleep at her residence in the historic district of Charleston, South Carolina. Evelyn was more than just a relative to me. She was the solitary tether to my humanity during my 18-month deployment in the dust and chaos of Kandahar, the only person who sent handwritten letters on thick, cream-colored Smythson stationery that smelled of lavender and old books while everyone else in the family was too busy arguing over who owed whom for a brunch tab at some overpriced bistro in Georgetown. As Mark began to read the preliminary summary of the will over the secure line, the numbers he recited started to blur the edges of my vision, shifting from a mere inheritance into a life-altering tectonic shift. She had left me her primary residence, a stunning 4-story antebellum riverfront estate on East Bay Street valued at over $6 million, but that was merely the tip of the iceberg because the primary trust fund, meticulously managed through a private wealth firm in Zurich, totaled exactly $82,415,000.67. The air in my office suddenly felt thin, the oxygen replaced by the sheer gravity of that figure, but it was the specific condition Mark emphasized that made my blood run cold with tactical clarity. The entire fortune was bequeathed to me and me alone, structured as a spendthrift trust with no co-signers, no family oversight committees, and absolutely no legal recourse for any other living relative to intervene in its management. I sat there in my uniform, the fabric of my OCPs feeling suddenly coarse against my skin, and I could already picture the predatory glint that would appear in Natalie's eyes the moment she caught wind of a number with that many zeros. To Natalie, $82 million wasn't a legacy to be honored or a responsibility to be managed. It was a limitless supply of Chanel handbags, private jet charters to the Amalfi Coast, and an escape from the crushing weight of her 14 delinquent credit cards. I knew with the certainty of a commander observing an enemy troop movement on a thermal map that the second my sister realized she had been entirely bypassed in favor of the sister she called boring and rigid, the psychological warfare would escalate into a full-scale legal and social siege. Mark mentioned that the formal reading would take place at his office on Broad Street in 72 hours. And as I hung up the phone, the silence of the Pentagon felt deafening. I looked down at my 2018 Ford Escape keys sitting next to my secure ID badge and realized that while I was worried about the maintenance of an 82,000-mile engine, I was now the guardian of a dynastic fortune that would make me the primary target of every manipulator in my bloodline. Natalie would not see the years of care I gave Evelyn or the sacrifices of my service. She would only see a mountain of gold that she felt entitled to simply by virtue of her birth, and I knew I had to prepare my defenses before she could even formulate her first lie. The war for Evelyn's peace had ended, but the war for her legacy and my own survival against the greed of my own sister had just begun at 1642. The wheels of the Delta Boeing 737-800 touched down at Charleston International Airport at exactly 8:15 on a morning that felt more like a steam bath than a homecoming, with the humidity already hovering at a suffocating 88% that made my olive drab tactical polo stick to my skin the moment I stepped onto the jet bridge. I bypassed the baggage claim with only my black Tumi carry-on and ignored the 3 missed calls from my mother on my screen, choosing instead to dial a high-security locksmith service I had vetted during the flight to meet me at the East Bay Street property within the hour. I needed to establish a perimeter around Aunt Evelyn's riverfront estate before the grief-stricken performance from my relatives could begin, but as my Uber pulled up to the wrought iron gates of the magnificent 4-story federal-style mansion, I saw the one person I had hoped to avoid for at least another 24 hours. Natalie was leaning against the hood of her alpine white 2022 BMW 8 Series Grand Coupe, a vehicle that looked pristine in the low-country sun but which I knew for a fact was currently 3 payments behind and subject to a repossession order from BMW Financial Services. She was dressed in a silk Zimmermann sundress that likely cost $1,400, her eyes shielded by those same Prada sunglasses, but she couldn't hide the predatory tension in her posture as she watched me step out of the car. "I heard about the 80 million, sis," she said without even a cursory greeting or a word of condolences for the woman whose body was barely cold in the local mortuary, and as she spoke, I could see her pupils were dilated with a raw, unadulterated greed that no amount of designer charm could mask. She pushed off the car and started walking toward me with a practiced, feline grace, her voice dropping into that manipulative, soft register she used whenever she wanted something that didn't belong to her. "Mom and Dad have been talking and they really think it would be for the best if we put the entire inheritance into a consolidated family fund for the sake of long-term stability and to ensure everyone is taken care of properly," she added, her hand reaching out as if to touch my arm in a show of false sisterly solidarity. The sheer audacity of the suggestion made my jaw tighten as I looked past her at the house that represented Evelyn's legacy, a house Natalie had visited exactly twice in the last 5 years because it was too quiet for her social calendar. I knew exactly what stability meant in Natalie's vocabulary. It meant a blank check for her lifestyle, a bailout for our parents' dwindling retirement accounts, and a total dissolution of the boundaries Evelyn had meticulously built into her will to protect me. I stared at her, my logistical commander's brain already mapping out the legal fortifications I would need to deploy, and I realized that my sister wasn't here to mourn a loss, she was here to stage a coup. The humidity seemed to intensify, the smell of the salt marsh mixing with her expensive perfume to create a cloying, sickly atmosphere that made me want to retreat into the cold, calculated precision of my military life. "You are about 10 minutes too late for a seat at the table, Natalie," I said, my voice cutting through the heavy South Carolina air like a serrated blade, and I watched the fake smile on her face flicker for just a fraction of a second as the locksmith's van pulled into the driveway behind us. This wasn't going to be a family discussion about stability. It was going to be a scorched earth defense of the only person who had ever truly believed in my worth over my utility. My sister thought she was walking into a windfall, but she was actually walking into a tactical trap laid by a woman who had survived much worse than a bankrupt socialite with an entitlement complex. I adjusted the strap of my bag and walked toward the heavy mahogany front doors, leaving her standing by her depreciating asset, and for the first time since the call at 1642, I felt the full weight of the $82 million acting not as a burden but as a weapon. I left Natalie standing in the stifling heat of the driveway and climbed back into the driver's seat of my rented 2024 charcoal gray Volvo XC90, my hands gripping the leather steering wheel with a white-knuckled intensity as I navigated the narrow cobblestone-lined streets of the French Quarter toward the intersection of Calhoun and King. My mind was a tactical map of legal contingencies and financial fortifications, calculating the precise minute I would walk into Mark Dalton's office at 170 Broad Street to sign the final execution papers for the $82 million trust. The air conditioning in the Volvo was blasting at a crisp 64 degrees, yet I could still feel the phantom warmth of the South Carolina humidity pressing against the glass as I checked my rearview mirror, seeing the distant silhouette of Natalie's white BMW fading into the shimmering heat haze of East Bay Street. I reached the intersection exactly as the light turned a solid, reassuring green, my foot moving steadily from the brake to the accelerator with the rhythmic precision of a soldier on a routine patrol. In a fraction of a heartbeat, the world transitioned from the orderly quiet of a Charleston afternoon into a chaotic symphony of grinding high-strength steel and the crystalline shriek of shattering tempered glass. Out of my peripheral vision, I caught a blur of white moving at an impossible 45 miles per hour as a generic delivery truck, its driver likely distracted by a glowing smartphone screen, ignored the red light and slammed directly into my driver's side pillar. The impact was a visceral, bone-jarring vibration that felt like being struck by a localized earthquake, sending a shockwave through the vehicle's frame that buckled the reinforced aluminum of the door in an instant. My side curtain airbags deployed with a muffled mechanical thud and a blinding puff of chemical dust, the white nylon cushions expanding to meet my skull before I even had the chance to scream. As the 2-ton Volvo was launched sideways, spinning across the asphalt like a discarded toy, the sounds of the city were replaced by the roar of sliding rubber and the frantic clicking of the hazard lights. Time seemed to dilate, stretching every millisecond into a painful eternity where I could feel the microscopic shards of glass peppering my skin and the sharp, hot snap of my left clavicle as the seatbelt pretensioner locked with brutal efficiency. Even as the world spun in a dizzying blur of sky and pavement, my military training overrode the primal urge to panic, but my thoughts didn't flicker toward my own mortality or the blood beginning to warm my neck. Instead, my consciousness narrowed with a terrifying, singular focus on the black Toomey leather briefcase resting on the passenger seat, containing the 342 pages of unsigned trust documents that were the only barrier between Aunt Evelyn's legacy and Natalie's insatiable greed. If my heart stopped beating before my signature touched those pages, the entire $82 million would default to a state-governed probate process where my sister's lawyers would tear the estate apart like starving wolves. The smell of scorched rubber and deployment gases filled my lungs as the car finally came to a jagged, smoking halt against a heavy cast-iron light pole, the engine hissing a rhythmic death rattle into the sudden silence of the street. I tried to reach for the briefcase, but my left arm was a useless weight of fire and agony, and as the first witnesses began to run toward the wreckage, I realized that the most dangerous variable in my logistical plan hadn't been Natalie at all, but the sheer random cruelty of a distracted stranger at a city intersection. The documents remained pristine and unsigned inside their leather shroud while my vision began to fray at the edges, the iron-scented reality of the crash settling over me like a heavy shroud. I had spent my life preparing for every possible ambush in the desert, yet I was currently bleeding out in the heart of a historic city with the keys to a fortune just inches out of my reach and a sister who would likely celebrate the wreckage if she knew the papers were still blank. As the distant wail of a Charleston Fire Department siren began to pierce through the ringing in my ears, I squeezed my eyes shut against the flickering light, praying that my discipline would hold long enough to finish the mission Evelyn had entrusted to me. The sterile silence of room 412 at Charleston Memorial Hospital was broken only by the rhythmic mechanical hiss of the oxygen concentrator and the low-frequency hum of the building's HVAC system, a soundscape that felt unnervingly similar to the pressurized cabins of the C-130 transports I had spent hundreds of hours in during my time in the service. My consciousness returned in jagged, painful increments, each breath feeling like a serrated blade drawing across my chest due to the 2 cracked ribs that the trauma team had stabilized with a rigid compression wrap. My left collarbone was a shattered mess of calcium and agony, now pinned together with a 4-inch titanium plate and 6 surgical screws that throbbed with every beat of my heart. But my mind was already shifting back into the cold, analytical state of a logistics commander assessing a compromised position. I knew that the moment Natalie realized I was incapacitated, she would attempt to use her status as next of kin to bypass my medical directives or, worse, gain access to the black Toomey briefcase that the paramedics had mercifully recovered from the wreckage of the Volvo. I refused to dial her number, knowing that her voice would only bring a performance of false concern designed to mask her reach for my bank accounts. And instead I used my functioning right hand to send an encrypted message through a secure channel to Chief Master Sergeant Boyd, a man who had served 3 tours with me and who possessed a singular, unwavering understanding of the word loyalty. I simply typed the words "I am down in room 412 at Charleston Memorial and need immediate perimeter control," knowing that the chief was currently working a private security contract only 12 miles away in North Charleston. True to his reputation for tactical punctuality, Boyd arrived in exactly 20 minutes, his 6'4" frame filling the doorway of my hospital room with a presence that felt like a reinforced concrete wall. He was dressed in a charcoal-colored polo shirt and tactical trousers, his eyes scanning the room for threats with the practiced efficiency of a man who didn't believe in family accidents or the convenient timing of distracted drivers. He didn't offer a platitude or a hug. He simply nodded once, his gaze lingering on the foredrip and the bruising on my neck before he took up a position near the door, his hands clasped in front of him in a way that signaled he was officially on duty. "Chief, I need you to ensure that no one enters this room without my express verbal authorization, and that includes my sister, my parents, and anyone claiming to be representing the estate," I whispered, my voice raspy from the intubation tube but carrying the full weight of a command. He understood the stakes without me having to mention the $82 million or the unsigned trust documents resting in the hospital's safe downstairs, because he had seen the way vultures circled a fallen soldier before the body was even cold. I could feel the tension in my fractured frame begin to ease slightly as the chief adjusted the holster concealed beneath his shirt, a subtle movement that told me the perimeter was now secure against any emotional or legal ambush Natalie might attempt to mount. In this world of shifting allegiances and blood-related betrayals, I didn't need a sisterly hand to hold. I needed a veteran who understood that a mission isn't over until the final papers are signed and the assets are hardened. As the afternoon sun began to cast long orange shadows across the linoleum floor, I closed my eyes, trusting the man at the door more than I had ever trusted my own flesh and blood. And for the first time since the collision at Calhoun and King, I felt like I was back in control of the battlefield. The physical pain was a constant, searing reality, but the strategic advantage had shifted back to me the moment Boyd walked through that door, and I knew that whatever Natalie was planning in her rented BMW, she was about to find out that a logistics commander never leaves her flank exposed for long. The morning light was cutting through the hospital blinds in sharp, clinical slats when Natalie ignored every established visiting hour protocol and marched into room 412 at exactly 10 a.m., flanked by a man who looked like he had been curated by a predatory talent agency. He introduced himself as Andrew, a private wealth advisor from a boutique firm in Midtown Manhattan, wearing a bespoke pinstripe suit that likely retailed for $6,000, though it was immediately clear that his tailoring was far more substantial than his professional integrity. Natalie didn't bother with the customary inquiries about my pain levels or the status of my shattered clavicle. Instead, she moved with a frantic, twitchy energy toward the side of my Hill-Rom bed, clutching a thick manila folder as if it were a holy relic. The air in the room, previously cleared by the hospital's filtration system, was suddenly choked by the cloying, aggressive scent of Andrew's oud-heavy cologne and the metallic tang of Natalie's desperation. "Just sign these power of attorney papers," Colleen, my sister, whispered, her face inches from mine as she leaned over the bed rail, her breath smelling of black coffee and peppermint. "You have a documented concussion and you are clearly heavily medicated on high-dose opioids, so everyone knows you aren't thinking straight enough to manage an $82 million estate alone," she continued, her voice trembling with a mixture of false concern and a transparent hunger for control. "Let Andrew and me protect the family assets from any further mismanagement while you focus on your long-term recovery in a private rehabilitation facility we've already researched in the Berkshires," she added, sliding a silver Mont Blanc pen toward my trembling right hand. I looked past her at Andrew, who was standing at the foot of the bed with a neutral, practiced expression that screamed of a man who had facilitated 100 backroom betrayals before lunch. I could feel the dull rhythmic throb of the titanium plate in my shoulder and the sharp pinch of the foreline in my forearm, but my mind was as clear as a tactical HUD during a night vision op. I shifted my gaze to the doorway where Chief Master Sergeant Boyd was already stepping forward, his massive frame casting a shadow over the both of them that made the expensive fabric of Andrew's suit look suddenly flimsy and cheap. "If you and your pet accountant do not vacate this medical facility in the next 5 seconds, I will have the chief here contact the Provost Marshal's office to have you both forcibly escorted out and detained for the harassment and attempted coercion of a commissioned military officer," I said, my voice rising from a raspy whisper to a command that vibrated in the small room. I watched the color drain from Andrew's face as he finally registered the combat boots and the cold, unblinking stare of the veteran standing behind him, realizing that he wasn't dealing with a grieving, drugged-up victim, but a logistics commander who had secured her perimeter long before he stepped off the elevator. Natalie's hand shook as she pulled the manila folder back toward her chest, her eyes darting between me and Boyd with a look of pure, impotent rage that confirmed she had severely underestimated the fortifications I had built around my life. The 5 seconds passed in a silence so thick I could hear the hum of the cardiac monitor, and I didn't blink once as my sister realized that the $82 million remained firmly behind a line she was physically and legally incapable of crossing. "Get out," I repeated, and as Boyd stepped fully into the room, Andrew began a frantic retreat toward the hallway, leaving Natalie to scramble after him with her red-soled heels clicking frantically against the sterile floor, her attempt at a bloodless coup failing before the ink on her fraudulent papers could even see the light of day. I watched them disappear into the corridor, the heavy oak door swinging shut behind them, and I let out a jagged breath that sent a flare of pain through my cracked ribs, knowing that while I had won this skirmish, the true siege of my inheritance was only just beginning. The deep, oppressive silence of the night shift at Charleston Memorial was broken only by the distant, rhythmic squeak of a Rubbermaid janitor's cart rolling down the linoleum corridor and the occasional muffled chime of a call button from the nursing station. I forced myself to sit upright in the adjustable Hill-Rom bed, a movement that sent a jagged white-hot flare of agony through my left shoulder as the last therapeutic effects of the intravenous hydromorphone began to wear off, leaving me with the raw, unvarnished reality of my fractured clavicle. With my functioning right hand, I reached into the side pocket of my Toomey bag and pulled out a standard yellow legal pad and a matte black Fisher Space pen, the kind that never fails regardless of the angle or environment. I drew a single vertical line down the center of the pale yellow page, creating 2 distinct columns that I labeled with the clinical detachment of a commanding officer preparing a battlefield assessment. Allies and vultures. Under the first column, the list was dangerously short, consisting only of Chief Master Sergeant Boyd, who was currently stationed just outside my door, and Mark Dalton, whose legal expertise was the only thing keeping the $82 million trust from being swallowed by probate court. My hand hesitated for a fraction of a second before I moved to the right side of the page, pressing the pen firmly into the paper as I wrote Natalie's name in bold, jagged strokes that nearly tore through the fiber. Beneath her name, I added a name I had uncovered through a frantic, one-handed search on the Secretary of State's business registry using the hospital's guest Wi-Fi, Clear Harbor Ventures LC. This wasn't just a spontaneous grab for cash or a desperate plea for a sibling's help. Natalie had registered this shell company exactly 48 hours after Aunt Evelyn's passing, using a registered agent address in Delaware to obscure her trail. It became chillingly clear that she wasn't just looking for a handout to pay off her delinquent BMW lease or her skyrocketing credit card interest. She was attempting to architect a sophisticated corporate empire, intending to use my name, my military credentials, and my inheritance as the primary collateral for high-risk property developments in the Lowcountry. She wanted to transform Aunt Evelyn's quiet, historic riverfront legacy into a series of hollow, glittering high-rises, leveraging the reputation I had spent 15 years building in the service to grease the wheels of local zoning boards. The betrayal felt more visceral than the physical trauma of the car crash, a cold realization that while I was bleeding out in an intersection on Calhoun Street, my own sister was already filing articles of incorporation to monetize my potential demise. I stared at the name Clear Harbor Ventures, the ink still wet under the flickering fluorescent light of the bed lamp, and I realized that Natalie had stopped seeing me as a sister years ago and started seeing me as a hurdle to be cleared or a resource to be mined. I gripped the legal pad until my knuckles turned a ghostly white, the pain in my ribs a constant reminder of the fragility of my current position, but my mind was already formulating a counterstrike that would dismantle her shell company before she could even print a business card. This was no longer a family dispute over a will. It was a high-stakes logistical war against a sophisticated predator who wore my own face and shared my own blood, and I knew I had to act with lethal precision before she successfully weaponized my identity against me. The yellow paper seemed to glow under the harsh LED light as I began to sketch out the first phase of my defensive maneuver, knowing that by sunrise, the vulture's column would likely grow even longer as my parents realized I wouldn't be bullied into their version of stability. I clicked my pen shut and leaned back against the thin hospital pillows, my gaze fixed on the shadows in the corner of the room, waiting for the dawn of a day that would require every ounce of tactical discipline I possessed to survive the coming siege. The morning sun of the South Carolina coast was already beating against the hospital windows, casting long, sharp shadows of the Venetian blinds across my white thermal blanket, when Mark Dalton entered room 412 at exactly 9:15 carrying a slim, reinforced carbon fiber briefcase. Unlike the flimsy manila folder Natalie had brandished like a weapon the day before, Mark's case contained the genuine heavy-gauge parchment of the irrevocable trust documents, each page watermarked with the seal of his prestigious Broad Street firm and the Swiss banking consortium that would now act as my financial fortress. He moved with a quiet, somber efficiency, setting the papers down on the adjustable overbed table and clicking open a high-end Namiki Emperor fountain pen that looked more like a surgical instrument than a writing tool. Sign here, and on the final rider, and the entire $82 million estate, including the liquidated assets from the Zurich brokerage and the Charleston property deeds, will be transferred into a private, multi-layered encrypted offshore account accessible only through your biometric signature, Mark said, his voice a low, steady baritone that provided the only sense of security I had felt since the 2018 Ford Escape was crushed into a heap of scrap metal. I gripped the heavy pen with my right hand, my left shoulder screaming in protest as I shifted my weight to reach the signature lines, and at exactly 9:30 sharp I pressed the nib to the paper. The deliberate, gritty scratch of the ink flowing onto the page felt like a gunshot echoing through the sterile silence of the ward, a definitive and irreversible declaration of independence that severed my sister's parasitic connection to Aunt Evelyn's life work once and for all. I watched the black ink dry, knowing that with those few strokes of a pen, I had successfully moved a mountain of wealth beyond the reach of every credit card collector and shell company Natalie had ever dreamed of conjuring. Mark gathered the documents with a crisp, professional nod, sliding them back into his briefcase and locking it with a digital keypad before he turned to exit, his polished Oxford silent on the linoleum as he bypassed Chief Master Sergeant Boyd at the door. Not 10 minutes later, the heavy oak door was nearly kicked off its hinges as Natalie burst into the room, her carefully curated facade of luxury completely disintegrated into a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. She was wearing the same wrinkled silk dress from the previous evening, her hair unwashed and her expensive Prada sunglasses pushed haphazardly onto the top of her head, revealing eyes that were bloodshot and wide with a desperate, frantic energy. She must have seen Mark leaving the elevator bank with his signature briefcase, because she didn't even bother with a greeting before she lunged toward the foot of my bed, her chest heaving as if she had just run a marathon through the humid Charleston streets. "What did you just sign, Colleen?" she shrieked, her voice cracking with a high-pitched desperation that made the heart rate monitor beside my head begin to pace at a rapid, rhythmic clip. "I saw that lawyer of yours. I saw the way he was looking at his watch, so tell me right now that you didn't just lock us out of the family legacy because Mom is on the phone crying about the foreclosure notice on their Vero Beach house." She lied, though I knew our parents' house was paid off years ago. She reached out to grab the edge of my blanket, her fingers trembling so violently that I could see the chipped remains of her $100 manicure, a stark contrast to the $82 million that had just vanished into a digital vault she would never find. I looked at her with the cold, detached gaze of a woman who had seen real combat and understood that a cornered predator is the most dangerous kind, yet I felt nothing but a hollow sense of relief that the mission was finally complete. The tactical silence I maintained only seemed to fuel her hysteria as she realized that the power of attorney papers she had tried to force on me were now nothing more than worthless scraps of paper in the face of the encrypted reality I had just authored. "You're insane," she hissed, her voice dropping to a low, venomous growl as she realized the golden goose hadn't just flown away but had been locked in a titanium cage in a different time zone. I stared her down, the pain in my collarbone finally feeling like a badge of honor rather than a burden, knowing that for the first time in our lives, The precision of my world had completely obliterated the chaos of hers. "You signed it, did you not?" she hissed, her face contorting into a mask of pure, unadulterated vitriol that stripped away every remaining layer of her carefully cultivated socialite persona until all that remained was the raw, jagged edge of a cornered animal. "Do you have even the slightest, most rudimentary idea of what I have already promised my board of investors back in New York?" she screamed, her voice cracking as she slammed her manicured fist against the cold, powder-coated steel of my hospital bed rail with a dull metallic thud that vibrated through my fractured ribs. "I told the primary stakeholders at the equity firm that the entire Mitchell family fortune was the foundational backing for Clear Harbor Ventures, and they have already moved $6 million into an escrow account based on the strength of your military credentials and that $82 million trust," she continued, her breathing coming in shallow, ragged gasps that smelled of stale coffee and expensive, desperate sweat. I sat there in the silence of room 412, the rhythmic electronic chirping of the cardiac monitor reflecting a steady, unwavering pulse of 60 beats per minute, a stark contrast to the chaotic, spiraling breakdown happening at the foot of my bed. "You chose to lie to a group of high-net-worth investors by using my professional name, my rank, and my personal inheritance as collateral for a shell company I never authorized, Natalie, and in the state of South Carolina, as well as under federal law, that is the literal definition of securities fraud and grand larceny by deception," I said, my voice sounding like the low, dangerous rumble of a distant storm across the Charleston harbor. "I did not just sign my inheritance away into an encrypted offshore vault to spite you. I did it to ensure that not a single cent of Aunt Evelyn's legacy could ever be linked to the criminal enterprise you decided to build in my shadow. While you were busy picking out office furniture and promising returns you couldn't possibly guarantee, I was using my functioning hand to forward every single one of those fraudulent screenshots of your digital prospectus and your signed solicitation emails directly to the office of the District Attorney for the Ninth Judicial Circuit," I added, watching the blood drain from her face until she was the color of the sterile hospital sheets. The silence that followed was heavy, punctuated only by the distant sound of a LifeNet helicopter approaching the trauma center roof, as the reality of her situation began to settle over her like a heavy, suffocating shroud of lead. She had walked into this room expecting to bully a concussed, medicated sister into a lifetime of financial servitude, but she had instead walked directly into a tactical ambush set by a woman who had spent a decade managing the most complex supply chains in the world's most powerful military. "I am not just a bank account for your failures, Natalie, and I am certainly not the collateral for your lies," I stated with a finality that seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of my bones. She looked down at her shaking hands, the $400 Prada sunglasses finally slipping from her head and clattering onto the linoleum floor, a discarded relic of a lifestyle that was currently evaporating in the face of a pending felony indictment. My sister, the woman who had always viewed my discipline as a weakness and my service as a boring distraction, was finally realizing that in the war of logistics and law, I was the only one on the battlefield who knew how to secure a victory. I leaned back against the thin institutional pillows, the pain in my shoulder finally beginning to subside as the adrenaline of the confrontation took hold, knowing that the $82 million was safe, the legacy of Aunt Evelyn was untainted, and the perimeter of my life was finally, for the first time in 32 years, completely impenetrable. The tactical execution of my counteroffensive took place exactly 3 days later. A surgical strike delivered with the kind of cold, logistical detachment I had perfected during my years overseeing high-stakes deployments in the Middle East. I was not physically present at the scene as I was still confined to the sterile, white-walled confines of room 412 at Charleston Memorial, my fractured clavicle stabilized by the titanium plate and my movements restricted to the slow, painful shuffle of a recovering trauma patient. But I didn't need to be there to witness the demolition of Natalie's house of cards. Instead, I dispatched Chief Master Sergeant Boyd to the rooftop bar of the Dewberry, a hyper-exclusive venue overlooking the historic spires of Charleston where Natalie was hosting a premature launch party for Clear Harbor Ventures using the last $5,000 of her overdrawn credit limit to fund an open bar of vintage Moët and Chandon. Boyd did not arrive with a celebratory gift or a bouquet of lilies. He arrived wearing a sharp charcoal gray suit that concealed his service weapon and carrying a heavy, legal-grade envelope containing a comprehensive cease and desist order and a 26-page forensic audit of Natalie's personal and business bank accounts that Mark Dalton's team had compiled in a frantic 72-hour sprint. As 40 of Charleston's most influential socialites, developers, and local politicians watched in a stunned, suffocating silence, the man who had survived 3 combat tours navigated the crowd of silk-clad guests with the unwavering focus of a predator. He reached Natalie just as she was raising a crystal flute of champagne to toast her supposed multi-million-dollar backing, and with a voice that carried the weight of a court-martial, he served her with a civil lawsuit seeking $2.4 million in damages for fraud, defamation, and the unauthorized use of a commissioned officer's military identity. The sound of the crystal glass shattering against the polished wood decking was a sharp, final punctuation mark to her charade, the golden liquid and jagged shards spraying over her borrowed $1,200 Jimmy Choo heels and the hem of her rented silk gown. Natalie's face, which had been glowing with the false heat of stolen success only seconds prior, drained of all color until she matched the white linen cocktail napkins clutched by the horrified guests surrounding her. She looked at the legal documents in her trembling hands, the bold headers of the South Carolina Circuit Court staring back at her like a death warrant, and realized that the sister she had dismissed as a rigid, boring soldier had just deployed a tactical nuke on her social and professional existence. The forensic audit attached to the summons meticulously detailed every redirected sent, every fabricated email to investors, and every lie she had told to the bank, effectively blacklisting her from every financial institution in the Tri-County area before the first appetizers had even finished circulating. Boyd didn't linger for the fallout or the inevitable hysterics. He simply turned on his heel and exited the rooftop, leaving my sister to stand in the wreckage of her own vanity while the elite of Charleston began to whisper and retreat toward the elevators as if her failure were contagious. Back in my hospital bed, I watched the confirmation text from Boyd flash on my encrypted screen at exactly 2014, and I felt a profound, quiet sense of closure that had nothing to do with the $82 million and everything to do with the restoration of my own name. I had spent my life protecting people who would never know my name, but this time the mission was personal, and the perimeter was finally, irreversibly secure. I leaned my head back against the pillow, the hum of the hospital fading into the background, knowing that while Natalie would spend the next decade drowning in depositions and debt, the legacy of Aunt Evelyn would remain exactly where it belonged, protected by the discipline and the fire of a woman who knew exactly what it cost to keep the peace. Exactly 7 days after the sterile white walls of Charleston Memorial faded into my rearview mirror, I checked into the riverfront estate on East Bay Street, the heavy wrought iron gates swinging shut with a definitive, motorized click that signaled the final hardening of my personal perimeter. The silence that greeted me as I stepped into the foyer was not merely a lack of noise. It was an expensive, hard-earned tranquility that smelled of beeswax, old Charleston brick, and the faint briny tang of the Cooper River drifting through the open transoms. My left arm was still cradled in a sleek black Donjoy Ultra sling, and the titanium plate in my clavicle throbbed with a dull rhythmic ache that served as a constant tactile reminder of the price I had paid to secure this sanctuary. My first order of business upon entering the mahogany-paneled library was to deactivate my primary SIM card and register a new, unlisted number through a secure military-grade encryption service, effectively severing the digital tether that had allowed my family to bleed me dry for a decade. I sat at Aunt Evelyn's antique Sheraton desk and reviewed the final execution of the $5 million annuity I had established for my parents, a financial structure designed with the cold precision of a logistics report. The funds were strictly controlled by a third-party trustee at a private wealth firm in Boston, with ironclad clauses that prohibited any lump sum withdrawals or any redirection of assets to Natalie, ensuring my parents would live in comfort without ever having the liquidity to fund another one of my sister's catastrophic fantasies. News reached me through Mark Dalton that Natalie had been forced to vacate her luxury condo within 48 hours of the rooftop disaster and was currently residing in a 400-square-foot studio apartment located directly above a noisy, chemical-scented dry cleaner in a less desirable corner of West Ashley. She is currently facing a massive civil suit for securities fraud and the $2.4 million in damages I am seeking to ensure she never possesses the capital to weaponize our name again, her days now spent in depositions rather than at trunk shows. I walked out onto the expansive rear porch, my Brooks sneakers silent on the weathered gray decking, and sat in a heavy teak rocker to watch the tide of the Atlantic begin its slow, relentless march into the salt marshes. The humidity was a thick 90%. But beneath the overhead fans, the air felt like a victory, A physical manifestation of the boundary I had finally succeeded in drawing between my duty and my dignity. I pulled my phone from my pocket one last time, looking at the final frantic string of text messages from the woman who shared my DNA but none of my honor, and with a single steady swipe of my thumb, I blocked the last remaining link to the chaos of my past. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the Charleston sky in bruised shades of violet and deep burning orange, I realized that the $82 million wasn't just a fortune. It was a fortress, and I was finally the only one with the keys to the gate. I watched a lone heron take flight across the water, the rhythmic beat of its wings the only sound in a world that I had finally managed to make quiet, and I understood that family isn't found in the blood that flows through your veins, but in the peace you are willing to fight for. The war was over, the assets were secured, and for the first time in 32 years, the only orders I had to follow were my own.